Here we have a position taken from a game that I played on the internet, and we can immediately see that White's position is very unstable. In fact, he's up a full rook, but he cannot hang on to that material. And the reason for this is because, well, if we use the counting method, we notice that this rook is attacked once and defended once. And so if we can bring more pressure to bear on that rook, then White may find himself unable to hang on to his rook. And indeed, that's exactly what happened after Black played the move Queen to e5. Now, White simply has no way of defending this rook, and he also cannot move the rook because of the pin on the king. But if we take a step back and we see this position here, we notice that besides this rook being very vulnerable, we also can notice that the rook on h4 is undefended. It's an unprotected piece. The queen on e3 similarly is an unprotected piece, although in the case of the queen it tends to matter a little bit less because the queen, being such a powerful piece, is, let's say, well able to defend herself. The bishop on f1 is also undefended, and that's a more vulnerable piece, perhaps the most vulnerable piece on the board, especially when you consider that the king on a1 and the bishop on f1, they are both on the same rank. Let's see how the game continued. Well, Black played the move Queen to e5, and here White played Queen to h3 with check. Black brought the king to c7, and now White played the move Queen to h2, which pins the queen, so in this way he prevents queen takes rook. Black captured, White recaptured, and now Black captured the rook on d4. Notice how this rook is now an unprotected piece, but still White's position is a little bit fragile because the bishop on f1 continues to be unprotected, as is the rook. Black captured the rook, and now White played the move king to b2. And the reason is because he had to watch out for the bishop being lost. But after the move king to b2, Black simply captured the pawn on e4 and was up 2 pawns and won the game shortly. Notice how in this position right here, it's not all about unprotected pieces, it's also about unprotected pawns. And so here, White has the unprotected pawn on e4, and he cannot spend any time playing a move like e5 to get it out of the e4 square, because if he does so, rook d1 would pick up that unprotected bishop on f1, so he has to attend to the more important piece. And this is a common situation that occurs. You have to be very, very careful with any point in your position that is unprotected, be it a pawn or a piece. Of course, the higher the value piece, usually the more careful you have to be. But at the higher levels of chess, even a pawn can lose you the game. So very, very important to try and have all of the points in your position defended. In practice, that's not possible. But one of the trademarks of stronger players is that they try to keep their position as solid as possible, as stable as possible. And a big part of that is making sure that everything that they can defend is defended. Perhaps worth mentioning as well is the second best move in the position, rook takes rook on d4. Now, this would also be a way of recovering the rook, because after queen takes rook, Black would have the move queen to e1 check. And here we see that the rook on h4 is falling. However, this move would not be as strong because after the move king to b2, which is forced, queen takes rook, we see that Black too has some undefended points. He has this pawn on g7 is being attacked, and as is the pawn on a7 being attacked. Of course, White would capture the pawn on g7 because then the undefended bishop comes into play. And here black's best move would be queen f2 check, in turn exploiting white's undefended bishop. But after king to c3, the black position is definitely better. And here black's best move is queen e1 check. And it's a very, very complicated position. Perhaps after a response like king b2, black could continue with the move queen takes pawn on e4. In this position, black's best bet is to continue with queen e1 check, king to b2, queen to d2 check, the king runs away to a3, bishop takes e4, and the dust has more or less settled, and black is going to emerge at least up a pawn after white captures the pawn on f7, and black is going to end up a pawn to the good because the simple move queen takes f7 actually would fail after queen c1 check. The king must run. a5 check, king to a4, queen to d2. We see there is a threat of checkmate here, and if white pushes the pawn, then after queen d4 check, let's say king takes a5, bishop to d5, and we see that even though everything is very complicated, the white king is in serious trouble. However, as black, this is really not the kind of path that we want to go down. Instead, here, by playing the move queen to e5, we sidestep all those complications, we recover the rook, and we keep this vulnerable point on g7 defended, which makes it easier to control an attack on this undefended bishop. Our queen is centralized, and we're even x-raying the white king. And on that note, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at part of a game, again, that I played online, and we're going to show what kind of problems can occur when you have a single vulnerable undefended point in your position, and how everything can sort of build up from there very, very quickly and can go wrong. So let's check that out now. So in this position, I, as black, had just played the move pawn to c4, attacking his queen, and white captured my queen. I recaptured with my knight, and in this position, white played the move pawn to a3. And this move, to me, seems already inaccurate. If we take a look at unprotected pieces in the position, we see that all of black's pieces are in fact protected. We see the bishop on g7 is protected, the knight on f6, well, that's protected by the g7 bishop as well as the e7 pawn. If we go over to the queen side, we see that the bishop on c8 is very well protected. And even the knight on b6, that's also protected. So we can see that black's position is very solid in that regard. White's position is very, very slightly less solid in that this bishop here on e2 has no protection, but the bishop on e2 is so well sheltered by the pawn chain and the fact that it's on white's second rank, so it's very difficult for black to exploit this. However, if we now move on to pawns, because as we said, pawns also matter, we see that for black, this pawn is well defended, well defended, well defended, well defended. The only pawn that is vulnerable, to my eyes at least, is this pawn on e7. But again, it's not very easy to attack it immediately. Nonetheless, black should be a little bit aware, a little bit careful of that pawn on e7 being unprotected. And, we commented that white's bishop was the only undefended piece right here. So if we actually just show the bishop and the pawn, we see that they're sort of in the same spot within the white and black camp. On the second rank for white lies the bishop, on the second rank for black lies the pawn, and these are two of the unprotected points in the position. But if we take a look now at white's pawn chain, well, this is well defended, well defended, well defended. we carry on. All of these we can see they're all defended. However, this guy on b2 has no defense because this pawn is the base of the opponent's structure. And based on this, the white position starts to feel not so comfortable to play. Black played knight to a4, attacking the pawn on b2. And if we go back to the counting, we notice that the count on the point on c3 is to 1, right? 1 defender and 1 attacker. As a result, in turn, if the b2 pawn moves, the c3 pawn right here will be the weak link. And notice as well how after knight takes c3, white is not in time to capture on c4 because guess what? That unprotected bishop on e2 comes back to haunt white. So the problem here was that white knew he couldn't advance his pawn, knew he couldn't just give black a pawn for free. And so the best move for him would have been the move rook to a2, defending the pawn in this rather awkward looking way. Although this is a section geared for relative newcomers to the game, so we're not going into too much advanced detail, but in general we can say that this move rook a2, white doesn't want to play because the rook is going to be a little bit out of the game. As we say, it's not very well placed. Because of this, white, after the move knight a4, went rook to b1. This way the rooks are on the same rank and they're connected and the rook is in a better square. However, black now targets the defender of this b2 pawn. Notice again, if we do the count, now it's 1:1. And he plays the move bishop to f5. Now bishop is worth considerably less than a rook, so white is immediately in a lot of trouble. If he moves the rook, black will simply capture the pawn on b2, and this position is pretty much losing for white. If, on the other hand, he doesn't move the rook, well, his only choice is what he played. He played the move e4. Black captured the pawn on e4. Notice again the count. 1, 2, 3. This is an easy capture. Knight takes e4. And bishop takes e4. Now black has already won a pawn, and his threat continues to be there. White couldn't really not capture the knight because black's threats were multiple. He was threatening to capture the knight himself, followed by capturing the rook. Or capturing the bishop on g5. So too many threats. And so white captured on e4, bishop takes e4. And here we notice that the pawn on e7 that we at first said, well, you know, it's on the second rank, it's not going to be a liability, etc., etc. We weren't too worried about it. But in fact, this is a very, very common mistake among less experienced players. They don't give enough regard to the possibility that down the line, an undefended point, even if at first sight it appears like it cannot be attacked, down the line in some variation, you never know with chess. And so white, in fact, took that pawn and created an attack. However, in so doing, this bishop goes from the point g5, where it's protected, to the e7 square, where it's not protected. And black plays the move rook to e8, creating a threat on the bishop, in addition to the threat on the rook. And white, in fact, resigned here. And the reason is because now he's losing a lot of material. Let's say he brings the bishop back to guard against that threat. Now black will capture the rook, white will recapture, and black will here have the move rook takes bishop on e2, meaning that he'll end up a full rook to the good. And this, of course, is far too much material to play on. But what I really like about this particular example is the fact that if we go back to this specific position here, that one point on b2 that kicked everything off was not the only undefended point in the position. We also said that the bishop on e2 and the pawn on e7 were both undefended. So what I really like about this example is how in the end, in the final position, there is no longer a pawn on e7 because that was taken. And there is no longer a bishop on e2 because that also fell. So it's funny, to me at least, how these particular points often drop in a line that all started with the undefended pawn on b2, which, funnily enough, in the final position still remains on the board. So that is that for this particular topic. And now I'm going to go into one final topic, which is very closely related, and it's called hanging pieces or hanging pawns, hanging points, let's say, in the position. And so I'll see you there.